Magic is a game of resources. Mana, cards, life, sometimes counters. Sure, you have your high fantasy trappings, wizards slinging spells while pulling energy from the land, but the actual gameplay is closer to building a factory, one that pumps these resources out. They are very valuable. Think of it like this: if you could draw infinite cards and make infinite mana, you could play every spell in your deck, and would certainly win. So, if you were to draw a lot of cards and make a lot of mana, you could play a lot of spells, and would be more likely to win. But you can play a million spells that draw cards and make mana, and get nowhere fast as you spin your wheels. So, a better question is, how does one produce these resources efficiently? Well, if you ask the community, they'll tell you to build an engine. But what is an engine? You've probably heard this term thrown around before at your local game store, but the actual definition is the subject of some debate. The working definition I've been using is that an engine is a card or cards that generate value repeatedly. That word, value, is what sticks out here. Value is an umbrella term. It certainly includes the resources we talked about earlier, but also covers anything your deck might utilize in order to win. For example, you can't spend damage in the same way you can spend mana, but eventually, most strategies will need to make damage happen to close out a game. Graveyard decks will often want to mill cards into their graveyard, even though it's not technically card draw. These are all examples of value, so the term starts with resources, but certainly doesn't end there. Alright, so, building an engine. How do we go about doing this? In my estimation, there are actually a couple types of engines that we can make, and working off examples will help illustrate this. Sometimes you'll have single cards that can produce value all on their own. You'll often hear these referred to as one-card engines. Cards like Black Market Connections and Llanowar Elves show off the concept pretty well. You end up using a card and some mana in order to put these onto the battlefield. While they hang around there, they produce you additional value until someone destroys them. In this way, engines are an investment. Oftentimes you won't be paid back immediately. Instead, you're going to be getting value back in installments each turn. There are notable exceptions to this rule though, and especially in the modern day, one-card engines have started giving you more up front. A great point of comparison is with Phyrexian Arena. This card has been around a long time, and it's pretty straightforward. Your investment is 3 mana, and every turn, it will automatically give you an extra card while losing you a life. Notably for this point, it triggers on your upkeep, meaning the turn rotation has to come full circle in order to start generating you value. Requiem Monolith was a card we were shown recently in the spoiler season leading to Edge of Eternities. It has a lot of text, but for a similar mana cost, it lets you lose a life and ping a creature you control to draw a card. It can draw more if that creature takes more damage, but what I really want to focus on is that activation condition. It's a tap ability, and since the monolith is an artifact, it can tap the moment it comes down. It requires you to have a creature, sure, but that faster recouping of costs means it'll probably end up being more profitable than the arena in a lot of games. And that's really what you want to be evaluating engines based on. How much value do they gain you, and how quickly? Looking at it through this lens, we can see how the One Ring went on to rule several formats. For 4 mana, you immediately get protection from everything for a turn, and draw a card. So it gives you a quick return on investment. Then, as turns go by, that card draw doesn't just keep steady, it increases in rate. This card scales, and yes, it requires the payment of life, but the value it produces way outpaces the competition. For these reasons, it's a game changer in Commander, Banned in Modern, and a good example of an engine that does not need help. But single card engines aren't the only kind that we have working for us. It's also possible to build multi-card engines. These are combinations of cards that, together, can create or convert one type of resource or value into another. If your deck revolves around a certain archetype, you'll often be leaning into these kinds of engines for your game plan. Say for instance we're playing Life Gain. We have a card that gains us 4 life each turn. Having extra life is nice, it lets us survive for longer, but that's not actually enough to win on its own. No problem though, we can convert this life gain into other resources. Necropotence lets us pay life to draw cards on our end step. The combination of these two pieces turns our invested mana into a machine that pumps out 4 cards a turn. Not too shabby. The fun part with multi-card engines comes from the fact that you can keep iterating on them. Let's say this engine draws us cards, and we end up with too many lands in our hand. Well, after adding Borborygmos Enraged to the setup, we can discard any of those lands to deal 3 damage to any target. The engine now has the option to convert life into cards and damage, assuming of course we continue drawing lands. The more cards we add, the more the engine increases in scope and efficiency. Putting in Azusa into the mix would let us play many of those lands. Now we're adding ramp to the engine. More life gain would add fuel for the card draw, etc. Multi-card engines, as you may have noticed, have the potential to be much more powerful than single-card ones, and that makes sense. Putting multiple permanents into play, paying the mana and cards for all of them, and then waiting to get their return is a much higher commitment than assigning similar jobs to single game pieces. So, it tracks that their collective reward should be higher. Also, a card's abilities are usually balanced around the other abilities they have, cards that can be played alongside them in Standard, and maybe some prominent cards that are leading other formats. With multi-card engines, it's impossible to balance card interactions with every other card ever printed, and so, especially in Eternal formats like Commander, multi-part engines can involve interactions that are much more powerful than originally intended. But that's not to say multiple card engines are always better. There's a concept in Magic of floors and ceilings. In a game where cards can have variable performance depending on the board state, these terms refer to the very worst and the very best a card can do. What we've been talking about so far is how multi-card engines tend to have very high ceilings, since they can involve compounding and unintentional interactions, but they can also have surprisingly cavernous floors. If you can't win the game quickly, for instance, failing to find the life gain component of our earlier engine can potentially lock you out of drawing any more cards for the rest of the game with Necropotence. Alternatively, missing the Necropotence could leave Borborygmos without enough lands to start killing players. The one-card engines, on the other hand, don't have to contend with this. So long as you play them, they can do their jobs on their own. The ceilings may be lower, sure, but the floors are much higher. This is especially nice in high-variance formats like Commander, where you're unlikely to draw the exact pieces you want due to 100-card deck sizes and being unable to play multiple copies of the same card. These concepts also aren't mutually exclusive. Single-card engines can contribute to multi-card ones, and they're especially good at starting off the chain. Cards that spontaneously produce value work as great jumping-off points to make an engine that is self-sustaining. Our life gain piece from earlier, for instance, just makes life. It doesn't ask you to pay something every time it does its job. This gives us the ability to continue doing our loop of life, cards, and damage without worrying so much about running low on the first resource. Something else to consider is that engines don't have to eat the resources they care about. Accomplished Alchemist, it can tap to make you mana equal to the life you've gained this turn. But notice that there's nothing involving spending that life on the card. It's simply a payoff for life gain with no strings attached. This makes it a great addition to the engine from before, giving us a burst of mana we can use to cast the non-land cards we're drawing off Necropotence. It also just plays nicely with most life gain setups in general. By now you've probably realized that every card I've mentioned so far is a permanent, and that's by design. Because of the ephemeral nature of instants and sorceries, they're not especially conducive to sticking around and grinding out value. For something to gain you value every upkeep, it generally needs to, be on your board every upkeep. This isn't to say that they can't be part of an engine though, as some of these can be recast. Capsize, for example, is a well-known card for being reused as a part of a removal engine when you have ample mana laying around. With infinite blue mana, it can bounce every permanent in play. Even instants and sorceries that don't come back on their own can often be looped. Archaeomancer, in combination with a card that regularly blinks him, can recur instants and sorceries to your hand for repeated use. So yeah, although it's not very common, it is possible to incorporate these card types into an engine. Okay, now we know what an engine is and why they're powerful, but there's one glaring problem. Right now our opponent has one. They've put together a powerful series of cards, let's say it's the engine from before, and it's up to us to figure some way out of this bind. So how do we break this up? Removal, removal, removal. That's the name of the game here. Many important parts of an engine are going to be non-creature permanents. There are many ways of doing damage to creatures directly, or forcing them to attack and block. This makes creatures more vulnerable than other card types. So oftentimes, the stronger and more played engine pieces simply aren't creatures. But even if there are creatures contributing to the machine, there's little chance our opponent is going to put them in harm's way. The advantage generated from the engine likely far eclipses their effectiveness in combat, and so they'll just sit there in relative safety. This is why removal is important. You will not always have the biggest stick. As soon as your opponent resolves a scarier threat than yours, it's nice to be able to take it off the board. But there are 3 cards here. How do we most disrupt this engine? You may be tempted to destroy the life gainer. It is the start of the chain after all, but hold on a second. Remember how before I said this deck revolved around life gain? That means the opponent is probably going to have multiple cards in that deck that can replace that piece. If they resolve any of these, it's back to square one. The conventional wisdom here is to make a judgment call based on both redundancy and power. If a card is very powerful, and it has very few analogs, it's probably a good target for removal. In this case, the standout performance is Necropotence. Making life into cards is absurd, and there are really only 2 other cards in the game that can do its job, one of which is banned in most formats. Taking out the Necro will cause the machine to fall anemic without opening up the opponent to restarting it with ease. As always though, threat assessment is a soft science at the best of times, so use your judgment and try to keep in mind power level and redundancy. But maybe you disagree, and that's what the comments are for. Tell me all about how Borborygmos is the bigger problem to a true 900 IQ Magic prodigy, or other tips you have for new players learning to build engines. I'm gonna be down there too, talking about engines and what makes them tick. If you're cool, and you want to help me game the algorithm, it helps immensely when you like the video. Share it with one of your friends if you think they'll get some use out of it. If you're a fan of what I do, you can subscribe to the channel to be notified when I upload. I also have a Discord where I talk to you guys on a day-to-day basis. We also get together to play Commander sometimes, so if you're looking for a group, come say hi. Lastly, I've got a Blue Sky, where I announce uploads as well as bug other creators, and I think that's everything. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.